I want to start by telling you what I was before 7th grade, because I think it matters. I think the before is important. People who haven't experienced a particular kind of damage sometimes don't understand why it lands so hard. And the answer is almost always about what existed before the hit, what was healthy and growing and unguarded, and therefore perfectly positioned to be destroyed. Before 7th grade, I was a writer. I know that sounds like a big claim for an 11-year-old. I'm not saying I was talented in any remarkable or prodigious way. I'm saying that writing was the thing that made me feel most like myself. I wrote constantly. I filled notebooks the way other kids filled soccer fields or sketchbooks, compulsively, joyfully, without self-consciousness. I wrote stories about girls who discovered doors in the backs of closets. I wrote extremely dramatic poetry about rain and loneliness that was, in retrospect, very funny and very sincere at the same time. I wrote in the margins of my homework and on the backs of receipts my mom left on the counter, and on the condensation of the bathroom mirror with my fingertip, letters that disappeared before anyone could read them. Writing was how I thought. It was how I figured out what I felt. It was the place I went when the world was too loud or too confusing or too much. And then I had Mrs. Patricia Kellerman for 7th grade. I should say upfront that I have debated whether to use her real name. I've decided to use it. Not out of cruelty. I'm going to get to what happened last month, and you can judge for yourself whether cruelty is something she's owed. But because I spent 15 years being ashamed of something she did, and using her name is part of not doing that anymore. She gets to have her name attached to her actions. That seems fair. Patricia Kellerman was in her late 50s when she taught me. She had taught English at our middle school for what felt like forever. The older kids talked about her the way you'd talk about a weather system, something to be navigated and survived. She was not universally disliked. Some students loved her. She had a dry wit and genuinely high expectations, and she could be, I am told, deeply encouraging to students whose writing she admired. I was not one of those students. I want to be careful here because I'm aware that 12-year-old me is not a completely reliable narrator of her own social dynamics. I know that some of what felt like targeting might have been ordinary classroom indifference, but I also know what happened concretely, and that part is not a matter of interpretation. Our class kept journals. This was a standard assignment. We were each given a composition notebook at the beginning of the semester, and we were supposed to write in them for 10 minutes at the start of every class. Mrs. Kellerman told us at the outset that the journals were private. She said that word specifically, private. She said she might occasionally collect them to confirm we were writing, but she would not read them. She would only check that pages were filled. I took her at her word. I was 12, and I believed adults when they told me things, and I had no reason not to believe this particular thing because it was also what I desperately wanted to believe. A private journal in an English class felt like a gift. I wrote in mine the way I wrote everywhere, honestly, openly, without filter. I wrote about the boy I liked and the friend who had started being cruel to me that year in the small, deniable ways that middle school girls specialize in. I wrote about feeling like I didn't fit anywhere and how I sometimes imagined a different version of my life in a different city with different people. I wrote about my parents' marriage, which was strained that year, in ways I could feel but not articulate. I wrote the way you write when you believe no one will ever read it. In November, Mrs. Kellerman collected the journals. 3 days later, she handed them back. I assumed she had done what she said, checked that pages were filled, nothing more. The following Monday, she started class differently than usual. She said she wanted to share some examples of strong journal writing. She said she had found some entries that were particularly vivid and emotionally honest, and she wanted to read them to the class as examples of what good personal writing looked like. I remember the feeling that moved through me when she opened a journal and I recognized the cover. I remember it the way you remember moments of physical shock, not the thought exactly, but the sensation. A cold drop through the center of my chest. She read for approximately 10 minutes. She read about the boy I liked. She read about feeling invisible. She read a passage I had written about my parents fighting and how I hid in my room with my notebook because it was the only place that felt safe. She did not say my name. She held the notebook in a way that obscured the cover, but my best friend at the time was sitting next to me, and she looked at me the moment Mrs. Kellerman started reading, and I looked back at her, and that was it. That was the confirmation. I sat completely still for 10 minutes. I kept my face neutral, the way you learn to do when you are 12 and you understand that crying in public is a social catastrophe from which some people never recover. I kept my hands flat on my desk. I looked at a fixed point on the whiteboard, and I stayed very still, and I let her read my private thoughts to 23 of my peers. When she finished, she said, "That is what emotional honesty looks like. That is the goal." The social fallout was not catastrophic in the dramatic sense. No one made a huge scene. The boy I liked, his name was Jacob, and he was sweet and had absolutely no idea what had happened, didn't say anything to me. Most kids didn't know whose journal it was, but enough did. The girl who had been quietly cruel to me already knew, of course, because she was the kind of person who always knew. She didn't say anything directly. She was smarter than that. What she did was subtler. A raised eyebrow here, a whispered something to the girl next to her there. The language of middle school social mechanics that doesn't leave fingerprints. I didn't tell my parents. I don't know exactly why, except that the journal entries about their marriage made me feel that I couldn't, that telling them would require me to explain what had been in the journal, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. I finished the school year. I stopped writing in the journal entirely after that day. When Mrs. Kellerman reminded us to fill our pages, I wrote the same sentence over and over. I don't have anything to say. She never commented on it. At the end of 7th grade, I threw the composition notebook in a dumpster behind a grocery store 2 blocks from my house. I walked there specifically to use that dumpster so it wouldn't be in our trash. And then I stopped writing. Not just journaling, not just personal writing. I stopped writing anything that was strictly required. Book reports turned in at the last possible minute, as short as the assignment allowed. Essays that were competent and bloodless. Nothing extra, nothing real. The notebooks I had filled my whole childhood sat in a box in my closet, and I didn't open that box 11 years. I am 31 years old now. I have a therapist I've been seeing for 3 years. Her name is Miriam, and she is the reason I am functional. And about 2 years ago, I told her, for the first time, this story. I had told her a lot of things by that point, but I had always described my relationship with writing in a kind of offhand way. I used to write a lot as a kid, I just kind of stopped, as if it had been a phase, as if it had just evaporated. The day I told Miriam the actual story, Mrs. Kellerman, the journal, the 10 minutes, the whiteboard, she watched me and waited until I finished, and then she said, "How old did you just become in this room?" I said, "What?" She said, "You just told me that story in the voice of a 12-year-old. You got smaller while you were talking. Did you notice that?" I hadn't noticed, but I started crying, which I almost never do in therapy, and that was probably an answer. We spent a long time on it. Months. The thing about a wound like that, and I want to be clear that I am not being melodramatic when I use the word wound, is that the damage isn't always visible even to yourself. I had built an entire self-concept around not being a writer anymore, and I had never questioned it. I had told myself the story so many times, I used to write, it was a kid thing, I grew out of it, that it had calcified. It didn't feel like a story, it felt like a fact. Miriam helped me understand that it wasn't a fact. It was a wound that I had dressed in the language of personal evolution. About a year ago, I started writing again, just privately, just in a notebook I keep in my nightstand. It was excruciating at first. Every sentence felt exposed. I kept stopping mid-paragraph and closing the notebook and putting it away, but I kept going back to it. And slowly, very slowly, the way you test weight on an injured leg, I found it again. The thing I'd had before, the place where writing was thinking, where it was processing, where it was home. I cried the first time it felt easy. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote for 45 minutes without stopping, and at the end I put the pen down and I put my head on my arms, and I sobbed in a way that surprised me. Relief, mostly. Grief for the years. Something like fury. Which brings me to last month. I found out through a community Facebook group, yes, I still have Facebook, no, I'm not proud of it, that Mrs. Kellerman had retired and was being honored at a reception at my old middle school. There was a small article in the local paper about her 32 years of teaching and her dedication to developing young writers. The article quoted a former student who said she had changed their life. I read the article 3 times. Then I typed a very long, very articulate message to Miriam, explaining that I was going to the reception. Miriam did not tell me not to go. Miriam is good at her job. The reception was on a Thursday evening in the school library. It was small, maybe 40 people, mostly former students and current staff. There were cookies on a table, and someone had made a slideshow of classroom photos going back to the 90s. Mrs. Kellerman was smaller than I remembered. She was in her late 80s now. I did the math wrong earlier. She must have been older than I thought when she taught me. And she moved carefully and accepted congratulations with a warmth that I watched from across the room for 20 minutes before I approached her. I want to tell you that I had prepared something. I had, in fact, written it out and practiced it with Miriam. It was not a speech, and it was not an attack. It was a clear, measured account. This is what you did. This is what it cost me. I am telling you because I need you to know. I waited until there was a small gap in the people around her. I introduced myself. I told her the year I had been in her class. She looked at me with genuine warmth and said, "Oh, how wonderful. Are you still writing?" I felt something move through me. I said, "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." I told her, not everything, not the years of therapy, not the notebooks in the dumpster, but the core of it, the journal, the promise of privacy, the Monday morning, the 10 minutes. She listened. Her expression moved through several things: polite attention, slight confusion, something I couldn't entirely read. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I don't remember that. I wouldn't have done something like that. It was always so important to me that students felt safe." She said it without malice. She said it the way you say something you genuinely believe. She was 80-something years old, and she had taught for 32 years, and I was one student in one class in one semester in 1995, and she did not remember me at all. I had prepared for anger. I had prepared for defensiveness. I had prepared for a version of this where she knew what she had done and denied it. I had not prepared for her genuine, placid, complete absence of memory. I stood in the school library with cookies on a table and a slideshow running, and I looked at this small, elderly woman who had taken something from me and had no idea, not out of cruelty, just out of the simple mathematics of 32 years and thousands of students, and I felt the most complicated thing I have ever felt in my adult life. I said, "I believe you don't remember. I just needed you to know that it happened." She patted my hand. She said, "Well, I hope you're writing. You strike me as someone who has a lot to say." I almost laughed. I genuinely almost laughed. I said, "I am. I started again recently." She smiled, and someone else came to congratulate her, and I stepped back, and I got a cookie, and I stood by the window for a few minutes. Then I went to my car. I sat in the parking lot of my middle school for a long time. I had expected the confrontation to feel like something definitive, a door closing, a debt acknowledged, something that would reorganize the narrative into a cleaner shape. What I got instead was the deeply human and deeply unsatisfying truth that the person who hurt you isn't always a villain. Sometimes they are just a person who didn't understand the weight of what they were carrying. Sometimes they forget. Sometimes you were one moment in their life that was the whole world in yours, and they moved on without ever knowing what they left behind. She didn't remember me. She read my inner life to a room of 12-year-olds, and then she went home and had dinner and planned the next lesson, and moved through 30 more years of teaching, and she never thought about it again, because to her it was probably not even a thing. It was a teaching choice on a Monday morning. It was a semester among hundreds of semesters. To me, it was the thing that turned off a light for 11 years. I don't know how to make those two truths fit together. I'm not sure they do fit together. Maybe they just exist in parallel, two separate, accurate accounts of the same 10 minutes, and the work is learning to hold them without needing one of them to cancel the other. I am writing again. That is the ending I have, and I think it's the one that matters most. Not every day, not perfectly, not without the occasional wave of that old exposed feeling, the sense that putting words down is making myself vulnerable in a way that can be used against me. But I write. I have 2 notebooks on my nightstand now. I write in them the way I wrote as a kid, honestly, without filter, without performing for an audience. And sometimes I close them and feel afraid, and I open them again anyway. I am 31 years old, and I am a writer. I was one before she got to me. I am one now that I have gotten back to myself. She doesn't remember me. That's okay. I remember me, and I'm the one still writing.